There's no feeling as special or gratifying as the moment you summon out your boss monster. Whether it's a game-ending threat, an absurd interruption, or even just the silly or unknown card that's unique to your strategy that you put everything into making. And the anime manages to capture that feeling incredibly well. From the cool and creepy bosses of villains and rivals, to the graceful, majestic monsters of our protagonists. So today, we're going to be looking at some of the boss monsters featured in the anime, how they've been used in the show, and why they were so impactful in the TCG. Absorbing the number 10 spot is Thousand Eyes Restrict, an even more terrifying version of Relinquish that almost allowed Maximilian Pegasus to land the final blow against Yugi. Thousand Eyes effect is split into two main parts. Its first effect relates to its Thousand Eyes, because once they're open, your opponent's monsters are permanently immobilized, preventing them from declaring an attack or even changing their battle position. Meanwhile, its second effect allows you to target a monster your opponent controls and equip it to itself, absorbing both the monster and its stats, just like Relinquish. And if your opponent tries beating over it, it'll protect itself by destroying the monster it's equipped with instead. Pegasus took great delight in forcing an opponent to attack their own monster, because while he was under the influence of the Millennium Eye, he was cruel and sadistic, even using mind games and the power of the eye to ensure he had complete control over everything around him, allowing him to lord over opponents with unaudible tunes while restricting their actions in both floodgates and joyful threats. But it was only in Pegasus's final duel of Duelist Kingdom against Yugi where we got to see this sinister nature shine. You see, Yugi and Yami Yugi pushed Pegasus to his limit by defeating the undefeatable, using the Mind Shuffle technique to constantly shift between Yugi and Yami so that he couldn't see what their next play would be. So to beat this technique, he forced Yami and Yugi to begin a shadow game, draining the original Yugi of his mental energy and forcing Yami to face off against Relinquished alone. Relinquished was a powerhouse because despite its non-existent stats, it was able to absorb and use Yami's monsters against him, even using the Dark Magician as a shield, forcing Yami to rescue him with Mystic Box. However, with the power of friendship blocking the gaze of the Millennium Eye, Yami managed to turn the tide of the duel in his favor, by taking control of Relinquish and using its equipped Jigen Bakudan and Dark Magician for the ritual summon of Magician of Black Chaos. This terrified Pegasus, but once he regained control of Relinquished, he fusion summoned Thousand Eyes Restrict and intended to absorb Black Chaos, which would have won them the duel and the Millennium Puzzle, if it hadn't been for Kuribo's Infinite Multiplication, which protected Black Chaos from being stolen while also binding Thousand Eyes and negating its effect by exploding on contact. But the funny thing is, while furballs were Thousand Eyes' main weakness in the anime, they're actually the reason it became a meta-dominant boss monster. You see, during the classic days of the game, during GOAT format, the extra deck was a lot different to what it is today. It wasn't even called the extra deck yet, it was just the fusion deck. And at the time, fusions were an abundant amount of investment needing polymerization and two specific named materials to go into, so it just wasn't worth it to fusion summon a monster, especially not one with really bricky materials like Thousand Eyes. Which is why you would cheat it out, and scapegoat control strategies were more than capable of doing so thanks to Metamorphosis, which you could use to tribute a scapegoat token into Thousand Eyes Restrict, turning a weak defensive wall into a strong offensive threat. And this particular strategy was so strong that it didn't just do well in the format, it defined the format for the longest time, with scapegoat control being the very reason we call it GOAT format. And because of how much a game would swing in your favor by Metamorphosis tribute a scapegoat token, Thousand Eyes was eventually banned in 2006 and remained on the list for a decade. But even today, Thousand Eyes is a pretty solid piece of removal. It's definitely not commonplace anymore, especially with its retrain being favored due to its strength in beating hand traps, but you can relive the glory days of GOAT by using instant fusion to cheat out Thousand Eyes and force your opponent to interact with it, otherwise their boss monster is getting absorbed. It's honestly amazing in of itself that over 20-year-old boss monster is still more than capable in the modern era, and can be just as much of a threat against Snake Eyes and Branded as it was against Warrior and Chaos Control. And just for its legacy in older formats alone, it deserves its place on this list, defining the format it was in as it further proved that Yu-Gi-Oh! Wasn't just a game of beat sticks and battles, since a zero-attack monster was the boss of its day. And swimming into number 9, we have number 101, Silent Honor Arc. The signature over 100 number of Shark, otherwise known as Nash after he accepted his Baryon form. You can make Silent Honor Arc by building the overlay network with any 2 level 4 monsters, giving you access to its 2 effects. Its first allows you to detach 2 overlay units to target a special summoned attack position monster your opponent controls to attach it to itself as a material. But Arc also has a defensive effect too, because if it would be destroyed by battle or card effect, you can just detach a material from it instead. Both of these effects are actually pretty indicative of Shark's character throughout Zexal. At first, he might have just seemed like a cruel bully intent on stealing the cards and decks of others, like how Arc steals monsters. But in reality, Shark had dedicated most of his life to caring and protecting those he cared for. However, Silent Honor Arc and Shark both shared a secret. Their current form isn't their true one, because just like how Silent Honor Arc harbored Silent Honor Dark, Shark's soul was that of Nash, the leader of the United Lands of Poseidon Ocean who, after his death, would go on to become Nash, the 7th Baron Emperor and protector of the buried world and his people. So it was only fitting that Shark obtained both Silent Honor Arc and Dark after he'd fully accepted himself as Baron, mirrored by the fact that it was Baron Chaos draw into rank up Magic the 7th one that allowed for Arc to unleash Dark. And this is usually how Shark would use number 101, drawn into the 7th one to rank up into Dark, but in his first duel using these numbers, we actually got to see him use Arc to its full potential against Quattro, dealing Gimmick Puppet to Giant Grinder with its first effect and nearly assuring victory. Now in the TCG, most players were never summoning Dark, especially not with rank up Magic the 7th one, because it was a pretty mediocre payoff for an incredibly gimmicky setup that requires so much to go right to actually use. However, Silent Honor Arc was a game-changing meta staple. You see, back in 2014, while there were a plethora of powerful XCs that had been released prior to Honor Arc, none of them could do what Honor Arc could do in quite the same way. Diamond Direwolf, for example, was a very strong tool for removal, but still destroyed and would clear itself from the field. And while Big Eye had an absurdly strong mind control effect, the number of decks that could access it was extremely limited. But Arc hit a very specific sweet spot between being an amazing removal tool and being easy to go into, which suddenly meant that you had to worry about your boss monsters being absorbed by a rank 4. An Arc-specific kind of removal prevents most kinds of graveyard effects from being activated, because the monsters removed aren't being sent to the grave or destroyed, they're being put under Arc, which denies your opponent access to potential graveyard resources, until they're sent from underneath it to the graveyard anyway. Now, Arc didn't do too much time as a premier rank 4 removal option, as within this same year we got Castel, which was arguably better than Arc since it shuffled the monster into the deck, and while this did mean that Arc saw a little less play, and didn't drop off in terms of viability, and still saw widespread play for a long while. However, in 2024, you are pretty unlikely to run into a strategy playing Arc, because now the removal tools we have available are even easier to access. So it's not as revolutionary now as it was 10 years ago. But attaching your opponent's monsters is still a pretty great option, as we've seen recently with full armored Dark Knight and Lancer. Light and Dark combine at number 8 with both Chaos Emperor Dragon Envoy of the End and Blackluster Soldier Envoy of the Beginning, two historically overpowered boss monsters. Both of these monsters are Chaos monsters, so they have a shared summoning condition. You need to banish one Light and one Dark monster from your graveyard to bring them out from your hand. If you summon Blackluster Soldier, you have the choice between two different effects. You can either target a monster on field and banish it, but preventing BLS from attacking for the turn, or if it destroys a monster by battle, it can make a second attack. Meanwhile, Chaos Emperor Dragon only has one effect, but it's a broken one, allowing you to pay 1,000 life points to send every card from the hand and field of both players to the graveyard and inflict 300 damage to your opponent for every card sent to the grave. Of course, being representative of the two opposing forces of Light and Dark, these Chaos monsters were wielded by the most iconic rivalry in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Seto Kaiba and Yugi Muto. You get to see Kaiba use Chaos Emperor Dragon in his KC Cup duel against Siegfried von Stradinger, who had kept Kaiba under a brutal lock where every monster he drew for turn would be discarded. And the effects of these three goddesses gave Siegfried enough time to summon out Valkyrie Brunhilde equipped with Sword of Nothog, as a counter to almost every one of Kaiba's dragons. However, Chaos Emperor Dragon wiped away the field and allowed for Kaiba to level the playing field. And on the following turn, a draw into Card of Demise gave him everything he needed to summon out his three blue eyes, as well as Chaos Emperor Dragon from the banished pile, resulting in a swift OTK. Such a dominant display is likely part of why Chaos Emperor Dragon ended up on the ban list, not just in the TCG, but in the anime, because by the time of GX, we learned that Chaos Emperor Dragon was canonically banned. Coincidentally, in the same episode we learned this, Blackluster Soldier appears as a new boss monster in Yugi's deck, but it wasn't Yugi who played the card. It was Dimitri, a copycat duelist who stole Yugi Muto's deck and tried to copy the personality of the King of Games in the hope that it would lead him to improving as a duelist. And fair to him, he did a great impersonation of Yugi, pushing Jaden Yugi to his limits throughout the duel, and of course getting to bring out Envoy at the beginning, who crushed Multihero Avian before using his effect to attack again and threaten Burstinatrix. Meanwhile, in terms of the TCG's competitive history, Chaos Emperor Dragon and Blackluster Soldier are as important as Yugi and Kaiba themselves. Chaos Emperor Dragon is the very reason that we have a forbidden list, because while there have been a selection of cards that have been limited or semi-limited prior to CED, it was CED's busted hand and field wipe effect that brought about the first bans in the game's history. On its own, it was already absurd for forcing both players into a top deck war, but if you could stick a Sangan or Witch of the Black Forest before you wipe the field, you would have the opportunity to search out Yatagarasu, which you would then normal summon and then poke and poke and poke. preventing your opponent from drawing every turn, meaning they were helpless as you gradually whittle away their life points 200 at a time. Meanwhile, BLS proved itself a legendary strong card that was a bomb of a boss monster in every early format where it was legal. It was essentially a better version of Chaos Sorcerer, not only being able to banish actual face-down cards, but also having the option to attack twice with its beefy 3000 attack, which could just end the game outright. Now, this was strong enough for BLS to eventually be banned just under a year after Chaos Emperor Dragon, but it came back way earlier in 2011, limited to 1 copy. But even after 6 years on the ban list, BLS was still kinda broken and was a bomb in just about any deck that could theoretically use it, with it reaching its prime in 2014, where this GOAT-era card rubbed shoulders with the likes of Shadowll and Burning Abyss, where it was just as much of a boss monster as it was during the game's early formats. Now, there's no doubt that the current context of the metagame, both CED and BLS, are a lot worse than they once were. The removal and OTK potential BLS has is now just pretty commonplace. And while CED's original effect would still be broken to this day, it's received an errata that has permanently made it unplayable, preventing you from using any other card effects for the entire turn if you want to use the board wipe. But regardless of their modern statuses, these are legendary monsters that deserve respect on their names. In planted number 7, we have Black Rose Dragon, the ace monster of the Signer Dragon of Akiza, and her alternate personality, the Black Rose. Black Rose has 2 relatively simple effects. Its second effect lets you banish a plant monster from your grave to target a defense position monster opponent controls, changes to attack position, and reduces attack to 0. But of course, Black Rose's most iconic effect is its field wipe, because if you manage to synchro summon it, you can destroy every card on the field. The Signer Dragons of 5Ds were generally reflective of those who wielded them, and the same is true of Black Rose Dragon, whose effect was indicative of the person of Akiza believed she was. You see, Akiza has psychic abilities, and these abilities allowed her to manifest dual monsters. However, she struggled to control them and often ended up hurting people around her, so much so that she believed herself a monster. With Black Rose Dragon being capable of destroying everything around it, or dealing a bunch of damage to a defenseless opponent, the similarities are quite clear. But no matter how tragic these effects are, there's no doubt that Akiza was incredibly effective at using both, either wiping the field with its first effect to clear away every card your opponent controlled to put her at a huge advantage and leaving them struggling, or its second effect to beat over an opponent's boss monster while dealing a whole bunch of damage. However, the thing about Akiza is that she was never really the monster that she thought she was. She just believed that she was an evil person because that's how the world had treated her. But in actuality, she was just a lost and hurt person who needed friends and a home. She was thankfully found in Team 5Ds and as the mascot for another cool and mysterious duelist. And in a really sweet turn of events, Black Rose Dragon itself also found its home, not just with another Signer Dragon, but also within the extra decks of thousands of duelists across the years. Wiping away the field is just straight up an amazing effect, as it blows up every one of your opponent's resources, and while you'll definitely lose your own cards in the process, being able to Dark Hole and Heavy Storm an entire field is game-winningly strong, especially since it's something you can access on demand from the extra deck. Which makes it even more surprising that Black Rose was among some of the game's earliest synchro monsters. And because of its busted effect, it's seen competitive viability since it was first released, appearing in just about any deck that could even theoretically make a Synchro 7, from dedicated synchro strategies like Plant Synchro to even Dragon Rulers. While Black Rose has definitely fallen off in viability since the wider array of removal options and other Synchro 7s becoming more readily available, it's still an incredibly powerful card in the modern era, with it being virtually uncontested in its board-breaking capabilities, allowing it to pop in decks that can use Revolution Dragon to pair their level 4 monsters, or just decks particularly proficient at making level 7s. It's honestly refreshing to hear that such an old and iconic boss monster not only has a storied competitive history, but also that the history is still ongoing, that Black Rose can and will still do well competitively and has a solid future ahead of it. It's been a powerhouse since its release so long as the right decks are playing it, and in a way, that's a great reflection of Akiza's story too. She was always a good person, she just needed the right people to help show it. Synchronized at number 6 is Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon, the evolution of YGO's Clear Wing Synchro Dragon. To synchro summon Crystal Wing, you need a tuner and at least one non-tuner synchro monster whose levels add up to 8. And what you get is pretty much just a straight upgrade of the effects of Clear Wing Synchro Dragon, allowing you to negate and destroy any monster effect while getting the attack of the monster you destroyed. And that's not all either, because Crystal Wing also has a bonus effect, where if it battles a level 5 or higher monster, it gains the attack of that monster during the damage step. Now, being remnants of Zark, YGO held a special connection to yugioh, which is why they were capable of synchronization and caused YGO and yugioh to duel together at the same time, with yugioh being able to see through YGO's eyes during his duel against Selena. By all means, YGO was meant to lose this duel, as it was partially fixed in Selena's favor, and she had YGO on the ropes after she summoned the unaffected Lunalight Leo Dancer, which YGO had no way of defeating. Well, almost no way of beating it at least, because due to the creation of Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon with synchronization, YGO had an opportunity to strike back, synchro summoning with Clear Wing as material and attacking over Leo Dancer with its honest-like effect for a game. And in the TCG, Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon is still an absurdly strong monster, one that altered the landscape of the game with its release as one of the earliest generic extra deck monster negates. You see, prior to the release of Crystal Wing, while extra deck negates were around, they were neither as commonplace nor as applicable as they are today, which is why Crystal Wing's introduction warped the game. Now at first glance, it might not seem like it's that accessible, but there's actually two different ways of summoning out Crystal Wing. The first is by synchro summoning it the normal way. This was pretty difficult when the card first released in 2017 until we got the Wind Witches, which was more than capable of synchro climbing from level 7 synchros to a Crystal Wing with just a single ice spell. However, the alternative way of summoning Crystal Wing was with Ultimate Tzolk'in. With Tzolk'in, as long as a card is set in the field, you could use its effect to special summon out any Power Tool monster or level 7 or 8 Dragon Synchro monster from the extra deck. And Crystal Wing was, and still is, the best target possible, protecting your plays on your turn while negating your opponent's best plays with its powerful monster negate, which is why even to this day, Tzolk'in is used in decks like Virtual World to bring out Crystal Wing. Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon has been a powerhouse since its first release, with it being one of the first powerful and generic extra deck negates that changed the landscape of Yu-Gi-Oh! Forever. And in any deck that can make it, either normally or with Tzolk'in, it's going to live up to its legendary status. And taking flight number 5 is Stardust Dragon, Yusei's Fudo's ace monster. Stardust has a simple but deceptively powerful effect, because whenever your opponent would activate a card or effect that would destroy a card in the field, you contribute Stardust to negate the activation and destroy that card. However, if you use this effect, Stardust isn't gone forever, because during the end phase, you get to special summon it back from your graveyard. These effects are indicative of Yusei's personality, because just like how Stardust sends itself to the grave to protect the field, Yusei was more than willing to risk his own life if it meant saving his friends and those around him. And Stardust Dragon existing as a boss monster in Yusei's deck gave it the strength it needed to save those he cared for. And we got to see this firsthand during both of Yusei's duels against Jack Atlas. During the Fortune Cup arc, where Yusei was fighting for his friends, for their dreams, but also to save them from being threatened. In both duels, we got to see almost the exact same sequence of events play out. Yusei manages to get Stardust to his side of the field to face off against Red Dragon Archfiend, and after Jack uses End of the Storm to destroy monsters of the field, Yusei uses Stardust's effect to negate the effect to prevent him from taking effect damage. But the reason why Yusei was so willing to sacrifice himself wasn't just because he was a kind person, it was because he genuinely valued the friends he made and the dreams they shared. And it was through those bonds that Yusei would grow and evolve, just like how Stardust would evolve. Now nowhere is that more apparent than in Yusei's duel against Z1, where he would synchro summon Shooting Star Quasar Dragon by using every one of Team 5D's boss monsters. And the really cool thing is, both of these aspects of Yusei's characters are actually represented in how Stardust was used in the TCG. Stardust Dragon's release was game warping. Even amongst the game's early synchros, Stardust was something special. It was a great beat stick and pretty easy to access, but its effect brought it to a whole nother level, because destruction effects were both incredibly common and extremely effective with the likes of Heavy Storm, Mirror Force, and Dark Arm Dragon, all being respected forms of removal. However, with the release of Stardust, those pieces of removal suddenly had some really interesting counterplay, and weren't guaranteed to always be effective. And even years after 2008, Stardust still saw continuous play in a ton of different formats, because for a while, it was one of the best Synchro 8 monsters you could make, since it gave you a proactive way of protecting your cards while establishing an impressive field presence. And this viability was further backed by Starlight Road, an amazing normal trap that protected your macro, and let you special summon a Stardust for free in the right circumstances. It was only around 2018 where Stardust did end up falling off a little in terms of competitive viability, as newer and stronger Synchro 8s would start seeing play. But it wouldn't be long before Stardust returned to the extra decks. In fact, you might end up seeing Stardust in current deck lists thanks to its evolution, Excel Synchro Stardust Dragon. A pretty powerful card on its own that's made playably stronger if you include Stardust Dragon in your extra deck as a way to synchro summon a quick effect speed while making the synchro you summon to towers. Stardust Dragon changed the game, that much is clear. But what's more impressive is that it wasn't some flash in the pan boss monster that was only good because it had no competition. Stardust was good because its protection was both valuable and viable, and forced people to change the way they play by just existing on the field. Connecting the real with the virtual at number 4 is Accesscode Talker, the last monster that Playmaker ever link summoned. Accesscode Talker is a link 4 with 2300 attack, but when it's link summoned, you can target one of the link monsters in the graveyard that was used for its summon, and then gain attack equal to the monster's link rating times 1000. And furthermore, it has a second effect that allows you to banish a link monster from your field or grave to destroy a card your opponent controls. The effect has no once per turn, but you can't banish the same attribute twice in the same turn. The best part though is your opponent can't activate cards or effects in response to the activation of either of these effects. Yusaka actually only used Accesscode Talker a single time during the final duel of Reigns against AI. You see, Playmaker was close to losing. Not only had AI managed to summon out the Arrival by using each of his fallen comrades' boss monsters, but every attempt that Playmaker had made to deal with the Arrival had been for naught. He had virtually nothing left, a fact that AI recognized, and because of AI's unwillingness to let go of the past and those it cared for, he hoped that he and Yusaka would become one in the virtual world. Yusaka, however, was not willing to compromise. With just a single Link summon, managed to call forth Accesscode Talker by using the revived Dark Fluid as Link material, reaching an incredible 7,300 attack. And like the Arrival, Accesscode Talker also relied on the strength of its controller's friends. But unlike AI and the Arrival, who were desperate to protect and preserve everything they had, even if it put them in danger, Accesscode and Yusaka were able to let go of the memories and trauma caused by the Hanoi project and look forward to the future, banishing 6 different attributes from the grave, one for each victim of the project, including Yusaka, to wipe AI's field so that only the Arrival and Accesscode Talker remained. And so, the highest attack Link monster of Reigns' history faced off against the highest attack Link monster of today. As these two philosophies clashed, only Accesscode and Yusaka should have remained. However, AI had used the graveyard effect of Gusari to bring the attack points of both monsters down to 3,000, causing them to both crash. Now, Accesscode didn't quite manage to win the duel here, but the way Yusaka used the game as a game ender was genius, and it's precisely how it's used in the TCG. Accesscode's OTK potential is immense, absurd even, and puts it among the game's best OTK enablers. But the reason why Accesscode outclassed nearly all of them is because of its ability to clear a field, and funnily enough, because of how easy it is to access. A card like Firewall Dragon, for example, is like Access, an amazing Link 4 for ending the game, and changed the game in its own right when it was released. But Accesscode is way easier to summon because it only requires 2 or more monsters, rather than needing 3 or more like Firewall. This means you can get to pair Accesscode with some pretty powerful Link 3s, and lets Accesscode hit 5,300 attack, which with any 2,700 or higher attack monster on your side of the field is game on an open board. And the craziest part about Access is that it makes its own open field. While it's unlikely you're going to be able to pop 6 times like Yusaka did, even just 1 or 2 activations of Accesscode can steal the game in your favor. It's for these reasons that Accesscode has become a widespread staple of virtually any deck that can make a Link 4 without getting locked, being a boon to both meta and rogue strategies alike as the best way to quickly end the game. And its presence, alongside the presence of other Link-based OTK enablers, has drastically sped up the game and changed the way we play. Because if you can't break an opponent's board, Accesscode is likely sleeping in their extra deck, ready and waiting to strike. And shockingly, at number 3 isn't the boss monster of a protagonist, rival, or even a main villain. It's number 16 Shockmaster, one of the boss monsters of a minor villain known as Fortuno from Zexal. If you can bring out 3 level 4 monsters to the field, you can access Shockmaster and its crazy floodgate, which allows you to detach 1 material and call a card type between monster, spell, or trap, and lock both players from activating that card type if you declare spell or trap, or lock them from using monster effects if you declare monsters until the end of your opponent's next turn. But for such a crazy effect, we only got to see Shockmaster in a duel a single time during early Zexal. After Shockmaster was summoned, Fortuna was able to tell that Yuma's hand was dominated by trap cards with his fortune telling, and so used Shockmaster to prevent any trap cards from being activated, including Yuma's bye-bye damage. But traps were the wrong call, because with Revolt, Yuma was not only able to detach remaining materials from Shockmaster, but that allowed him to use Voltage Summon to bring out 2 level 4s from his deck and build the overlay network to form number 39 Utopia. Yuma eventually went on to win this duel, but the way Fortuno used Shockmaster was actually correct. But Shockmaster wasn't just limited to trap cards, which is why it was so busted. Being locked under the card after it called monster was debilitating, because it prevented you from comboing off and doing much of anything other than setting cards and passing your turn. The worst part though was that you didn't need to use Shockmaster's effect immediately, and you could just wait until after you fully comboed off to lock both players out of a certain effect, well after you've used everything you needed to. And assuming that Shockmaster survived, which is likely that it would, you could just use its effect again, beating your opponent's trap cards or just locking them out of monsters again to push for lethal without needing to worry about Battle Fader. The only thing that held Shockmaster back was that not every deck could make it, but for decks that could, it was way easier than it ever should have been, which is likely why Shockmaster ended up locked behind the ban list just over a year after its release. It's kind of funny that amongst ace monsters, evolutions, protagonists, and rivals, one of the most broken boss monsters from the anime is a small-time villain. But while the duelists had virtually no impact on the anime, their boss monster stands as one of the pillars of Yu-Gi-Oh's ban list. as a card that will never be able to return. Infected the number 2 spot is Topologic Gumblar Dragon, one of the Topologic boss monsters that Varus pulled from the Data Storm. Like the other Topologics, Gumblar has an effect whenever a monster is special summoned to a zone that a linked monster points to, and in this, it allows you to discard 1 or 2 random cards from your hand to force your opponent to discard the same number. However, Gumblar also has an extra effect, allowing you to force your opponent to discard 1 or 2 cards if Gumblar is extra linked, and then if they have no cards in their hand, you burn them for 3000 damage. But not only do each of these effects have hard ones per turn, you can only use one of these effects per turn. Gumblar might have been the most important Topologic dragon that Varus pulled from the Data Storm. You see, during their duel at the Tower of Hanoi, both Playmaker and Varus were fighting for the fate of those they cared for. Playmaker for the existence of AI, and Varus for the sake of humanity. Which is why, when a particularly dense data storm rolled around, neither of them hesitated. But due to the strength of the storm, they couldn't access it without help. Playmaker got help through AI, but Varus lost so much more from the storm because the help he received was from his father, who used the last of his strength to regenerate Varus' lost arm to allow him to properly access the storm to generate Gumblar Dragon. And in this particular duel, Varus used Gumblar's first effect excellently, destroying all cards in both of their hands and then using the effect of Drop Draco to force a draw. But after Yusaka tracked down Varus, aka Rokon in real life, they put their ideals to the test one more time and both logged into Vrains for one final duel of philosophies. This duel had a bunch of moving parts to it, but we did get to see Gumblar Dragon summoned again, completing the anime's first extra link, and even got to use its second effect to leave Playmaker with virtually nothing, and would have won the duel with its burn if it hadn't been for Yusaka's trap card. Now, Playmaker did manage to turn the duel around in his favor, and later even used Gumblar's effect to his advantage with the Graveyard effect, a spam mail. But while Graveyard effects are common at TCG, it is extremely difficult to have Gumblar's effect turn out in your favor. In fact, there are 3 key reasons why Gumblar was banned and remains banned to this day. 1. Ripping cards from your opponent's hand is absurdly strong at Yu-Gi-Oh! By removing even a single card from your opponent's hand, you've removed a potential threat. And while Gumblar requires you to discard 2 of your own cards, if you manage to establish it and use its effect first, you already have more than enough resources to spare. 2. Gumblar is generic, and can be made by just about any deck that can spit out the link materials necessary for its summon, but was specifically infamous with Goki, a deck that not only could reach Gumblar, but did so through Isolde, which gave you potentially free discards in Phoenix Blade, a free search, and a summon from the deck, and could even be summoned with Neospace Connector to summon out Neospace and Aqua Dolphin to rip yet another card from your opponent's hand. And point 3, its first effect can be activated on your opponent's turn if a monster is summoned to its link pointing arrow, which you could trigger yourself before your opponent's first main phase with a Link Rebo, letting you rip another 2 cards from your opponent's hand, leaving them with just 1 left to break your board. Essentially, Gumblar's existence was toxic, as it enabled a style of gameplay that resulted in your opponent not being able to play. And while Varus used Gumblar excellently in honor of his father, it's good that this malware was eventually deleted from the game. And linking as number 1 is the most busted anime boss monster we received, and the original ace of Playmaker, Firewall Dragon. Firewall can be made with 2+ effect monsters, making it incredibly generic, and has 2 effects. Its first effect can only be used once while it's visible on the field, and allows you to target monsters in the field or graveyard, up to a number of monsters that are co-linked to Firewall and return them to the hand. Meanwhile, its second effect is a hard once per turn, and allows you to special summon a Cyberse monster from your hand if a monster Firewall points to is destroyed by battle or sent to the graveyard. The way Playmaker used Firewall is actually pretty interesting, because it's entirely different to how it was used in the TCG. Playmaker used Firewall offensively, using its first effect to clear away an opponent's board with the power of its co-links, and then using Firewall as it was intended to be used as a boss monster, attacking over threats and taking on rival bosses. But it was pretty rare that we ever got to see Yusaka use Firewall's second effect, only using it in a single duel. This way of using Firewall is a great way of representing just how much Yusaka cares about the bonds he's forged with his friends, because any board or co-link that he makes increases the strength of Firewall even further and allowed him to break a board or save the monsters that were sent to his graveyard. But in the TCG, Firewall Dragon represented a different story and was one of, if not the most oppressive boss monster in the game's history. And it's mainly because of its second effect, which has actually been errated, because originally the effect could summon out any monster from your hand and could do so multiple times as this effect initially had no once per turn. This paired perfectly with the likes of Cannon Soldier or any monster that tributed another to deal burn damage, because after tributing a monster linked to Firewall, you got to trigger its second effect. This meant that with the right monster, you could easily generate infinite burn damage, and was most infamously used with Dark World FTK, which would use Cannon Soldier to tribute Grapha to then let you summon a Dark World monster from your hand with Firewall, which could then be returned to the hand to summon Grapha so that you could tribute him again over and over until your opponent's life points reach 0. And the crazy part is, these FTKs were consistent, in part due to Firewall's first effect, because with Curious sending any card from your deck to the graveyard, you could just send Cannon Soldier and add it back to your hand to be summoned with Firewall later. But even outside of its FTK potential, Firewall was just absurd and one of the best link payoffs available for a long period of time, and even had the perfect link arrows to more easily enable extra linking, which in Master Rule 4 would basically lock your opponent out of the extra deck. Firewall did what we once thought was impossible. They got the Ace Monster Protagonist banned, simply because it was one of the most oppressive, easy to use, and accessible boss monsters ever made. Alright, and that's the list. If you think we missed any other strong anime bosses, please let us know down in the comments below. And remember to like the video, subscribe if you want to keep up to date on any future lists just like this one, and thanks for watching.